Today, we are diving into a text from the 4th century BCE. But don't let the age fool you. This is not some dry collection of historical facts. No, this is the work that, you could argue, pretty much invented large-scale storytelling in China. It's a foundational masterpiece that shaped how stories were told for literally thousands of years.
And hey, you don't just have to take my word for it. Scholars call the Zuo Tradition, and I'm quoting here, the first sustained large-scale narrative work in the canon of Chinese literature. Now that is a huge claim, so let's break down what exactly makes this ancient text so incredibly revolutionary.
So, here's our game plan for this deep dive. First, we'll look at how it became such a foundational masterpiece. Then, we'll explore its really unique narrative structure and its fascinating split-personality writing style. After that, we'll see how it uses its characters to teach some pretty deep moral lessons, and we'll wrap it all up by looking at its incredible, long-lasting legacy. All right, let's jump right in. Part 1, a foundational masterpiece. So how on earth did a work that started out as just a commentary on another text become this huge classic in its own right? Let's find out.
So what is the Zuo Tradition, exactly? Well, imagine you have this really old, incredibly brief historical record. We're talking bare bones, one-line entries. That's the Spring and Autumn Annals. What the Zuo Tradition does is take those cryptic notes and just breathe life into them, turning them into full-blown, detailed, dramatic stories.
And check out the timing here. The Zuo Tradition was actually written after the period it's describing. So it's a look back at this really chaotic, fascinating time, the Spring and Autumn era. You've got intense conflict, tricky diplomacy, backstabbing court intrigue. The author is essentially crafting this grand, sweeping story out of the raw material of the past.
But here's the big twist, according to scholars. This isn't just history, not in the way we think of it. The text is packed with these incredibly detailed speeches and vivid descriptions that feel way more like literary art than a dry, factual report. The goal wasn't just to say, this happened. It was to use those events to teach really powerful moral lessons. You could almost think of it as an early kind of historical fiction, designed to make you think.
Which brings us perfectly to our second section, the architecture of narrative. So let's pull back the curtain and see how this incredible story is actually put together.
First off, you gotta understand that this book wasn't written by one person in a single sitting. Not at all. It's a composite work, pieced together over time from a whole bunch of different sources. This gives it this really cool episodic structure. It's almost like a collection of interconnected short stories. And it lets the narrative jump around in time, using things like foreshadowing and flashbacks to build a much richer world. And the power of that structure is just immense. This episodic style creates what scholars call heteroglossic breadth, which is really just a fancy way of saying it features a ton of different voices. Instead of just getting one single point of view, it gives a platform to everyone. You hear from dukes, ministers, low-level officials, and even women. This creates a remarkably rich and complex picture of society. Now, one of its most powerful techniques is foreshadowing. The narrator is constantly dropping hints about what's going to happen, maybe through an omen, a dream, or a wise advisor's warning. But here's the thing. The goal isn't to create suspense. Actually, we often know who's going to fail right from the start. Instead, this trick shifts our focus away from what happens to why it happens. It forces us to look for the moral causes behind everything. And because of that focus on the why, a lot of the stories follow this really clear, predictable moral pattern. First, a character violates what's known as ritual propriety. Think of it as the established social and ethical rulebook. Then, step 2, an omen appears or an advisor speaks up, pointing out the mistake. And finally, step 3, the inevitable disaster happens. See? The whole structure is designed to show you that actions have very real, very direct consequences. Okay, on to section 3, where we get into one of the most unique things about this text, its stylistic duality. It's almost like you're reading two completely different books at the same time. This is one of the most fascinating parts of the Zuo Tradition. The third-person narration, the part that just describes the events, is incredibly short and to the point. It's dispassionate, just a facts, moving along at a super fast rhythm. But then you get to the dialogue, and the style does a complete 180. The speeches are lively, complex, full of rhetorical flair. They are pure artistic creations designed for maximum dramatic punch. It's like night and day. So this is so important. These speeches are not word-for-word historical transcripts. They're artistic inventions, the authors carefully crafting them to serve as models of powerful speaking and to deliver really clear moral and political points. They're basically lessons in persuasion, all wrapped up in beautiful, dramatic language.
Section 4. Character and Moral Lessons. Now let's dig into how the text uses its characters to reveal some pretty deep truths through storytelling.
The text hardly ever just tells you what a character is like. Instead, it shows you through their subtle actions, the little gestures, and the specific words they choose. Something as tiny as a ruler's twitching finger might be a signal that a huge event is about to go down. It's classic show, don't tell, and it creates real psychological depth, forcing you, the reader, to pay very close attention. A perfect example of this is the very first big story about a ruler named Lord Zhuan of Zheng. The way his story is told, you could interpret his motives in completely different ways. I mean, is he naive and just putting up with a lot? Or is he actually suspicious and cynical underneath it all? The text never gives you a straight answer.
And that ambiguity, it's totally on purpose. It's a teaching method. By refusing to give you a simple good guy or bad guy, the text forces you to practice what's called historical judgment, to weigh the evidence and make your own ethical call. It's not training you what to think, it's training you how to think. So, what did all this innovation lead to? In our final section, let's look at the text's incredible legacy and how it literally became a blueprint for how to write history. The impact of the Zuo tradition is just huge. It's almost impossible to overstate. It had an incalculable influence on pretty much all later Chinese literature and historical writing. You can totally see its DNA in what is maybe the most famous work of Chinese history, Sima Qian's Records of the Grand Historian.
This chart really lays it all out and puts its uniqueness into perspective. Look at the Zuo tradition right there in the middle. The earlier annals, just a simple chronicle. The later records, mostly focused on biographies. But the Zuo tradition is pure narrative history. It teaches its lessons from inside the story, not by tacking on some commentary at the end. And notice its complex portrayal of women? That's very different from a lot of later historical works.
And this really highlights what makes it so special. Later histories often came with stricter, more rigid ideologies. For instance, sometimes boiling women's roles down to just being the cause of political disasters. But because the Zuo tradition was pieced together from so many different sources, its very structure naturally preserved a richer, more complex, and frankly, a more interesting view of society.
All right, so let's boil this all down. What are the big things to remember? First, the Zuo tradition transformed the simple historical chronicle into a powerful form of narrative art. Second, its unique structure made room for tons of different, complex voices. Third, it masterfully balanced that direct, factual prose with beautifully elaborate, artistic speech. And finally, it taught moral judgment, not by preaching, but by making the reader part of the story.
Through its incredible artistry, its deep moral and psychological complexity, and its sheer narrative depth, the Zuo tradition didn't just record history, it invented a brand new way to understand it. And in doing so, it cemented its place, without a doubt, as a foundational masterpiece of world literature.